In 1989, Tacoma, Washington, was in the grip of a violent gang epidemic that had turned its streets into a battleground. Amidst this turmoil, Staff Sgt. Bill Foulk, an Army Ranger stationed at Fort Lewis, purchased a rundown house on Ash Street in one of the city's roughest neighborhoods. Little did he know that his investment would thrust him into an unexpected shootout between the Army Rangers and the Hilltop CRIPS. But before we get into all that, please like, subscribe, and comment below with questions or whatever. It's the Crime Street Journal. The late 1980s marked the peak of the crack epidemic in the United States, with a 180% surge in drug-related crime throughout the decade according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics. Tacoma was considered ground zero for gang activity in Washington state. So when Staff Sgt. Bill Foulk moved into his neighborhood, he was deeply concerned about a neighboring house on Ash Street being used for dealing crack cocaine. Determined to fight this, he took it upon himself to begin a mission to transform his neighborhood. Foulk started by discreetly videotaping activities around the suspected drug house. His suspicions were confirmed when he identified members of the CRIPS, a violent street gang spreading from California to Washington, using the property. Foulk began documenting their movements. He installed a camera in one of his windows, and when the gang members became aware of the surveillance system and took measures to knock it out, including throwing objects to the device. When that didn't work, they attempted to shoot it out with a BB gun. Foulk confronted the gang, telling them to stop shooting at his house and selling drugs in the neighborhood. As expected, this didn't go down well, with them telling the Army Ranger to mind his own business, which he wasn't interested in doing. Following his interaction with the gang members, Staff Sgt. Foulk became convinced they may attack him. He sent away his wife and asked his fellow Rangers to come over for a barbecue. About 15 Rangers arrived. During the barbecue, people at the house across the street threw rocks and rotten fruit at the upstairs video camera. Some made threatening gestures to those attending the party, and one fired at Foulk's house with a BB gun. Foulk and some other Rangers crossed the street and confronted the other group. The CRIPS refused to stop throwing things and shooting BBs, while Foulk refused to stop filming their activities. According to Foulk, they then threatened to kill him. Some residents of the neighborhood, including occupants of the house across the street, presented a different narrative in which the Rangers had taunted them and laughed at them. Returning to his home, Foulk called other Rangers for backup. The force of about 12 soldiers drew up defensive plans, and Foulk installed a wooden barricade. Foulk also called a journalist and photographer from the News Tribune, who came to the home. Foulk carried a Browning high-power and Colt .357. The other Rangers' weapons included an AR-15 rifle, an M14 rifle, a 12-gauge shotgun, and a number of handguns. All of the Rangers' weapons were personally owned, not military issued. The gunfight began at 9:20 p.m. After sunset. It is unclear which side fired first. Both claim it was the other. In the ensuing battle, people fired toward Foulk's house from behind parked cars, and Rangers fired back as one partygoer, herself armed, called 911. Shooting continued for about 15 minutes between the Rangers and the Hilltop CRIPS. Police arrived on the scene and then briefly retreated when gunfire continued. Ultimately, at least a dozen arrived. Those who had been firing at the Rangers fled. Arriving police officers first detained everyone at the Foulk residence and sought to confiscate their guns as evidence. The officer tasked with disarming the Rangers, feeling that they had done nothing wrong, struck a deal in which they would hand over only their less valuable guns. All weapons taken were owned lawfully. The police then pursued those who had run away, partly based on descriptions given by the Rangers, and arrested 2 on outstanding warrants. The first police officers to respond estimated 50 to 60 shots fired in less than a minute, with the total number fired around 300. No one was reported injured at the time of the shooting. Foulk said to 48 Hours in 1990 that he had told the Rangers to avoid hitting anyone for fear of being sued. Russ Carmack, the News Tribune's photographer at the scene, later said that he had heard a police commander lecture the Rangers for failing to hit anyone. In 2009, Foulk said to the News Tribune that one Ranger had in fact winged someone who charged the house. In 2022, he said to Fox 13 Seattle that the Rangers shot multiple people who fled the scene rather than wait for emergency medical services. Of the 2 people arrested, one was charged. He maintained to 48 hours while awaiting trial that the Rangers had fired first, unprovoked, a claim that correspondent Bernard Goldberg found implausible. He said that he and the others had not been engaged in any criminal conduct, although he acknowledged that he had been smoking marijuana after Goldberg showed photographic evidence. The man's lawyer defended him to Goldberg as having been simply the slowest runner. The man was convicted of second-degree assault and sentenced to 22 months in prison. The shootout and the national attention it brought were an embarrassment for the Tacoma police and accelerated the plans of its chief, Ray Fietland, to move toward a model of community-oriented policing. Positions were refilled on Hilltop's crime management team and community liaisons were established. The News Tribune, in a retrospective piece published 20 years after the event, framed it as a catalyst for policing improvements and an eventual decrease in crime on Ash Street. The Tacoma police established an office in Hilltop in 1990 to work on shutting down drug houses. As of 2022, Foulk continues to live in the same house, with all bullet holes patched, except one left as a reminder.